Welcome back. It's time for another book talk video. Today it's Monday. It's Magical Monday. That means I get to talk about fantasy, which is always exciting because I love fantasy stories. Today we're looking back at one of the Appendix N entries. This is Three Hearts and Three Lions by Poul Anderson. It's a classic in the fantasy genre. This book also was a huge inspiration to Gary Gygax for the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. The novella, I believe, was from 1953 and then was expanded into a full novel in 1961. If you look back historically, hopefully you'll find it as a complete expanded version, but there's slight chance you might find the novella. A lot of different covers for it, some really old fantasy artwork, and some really interesting different variations, so I would recommend you shop around for whatever cover that you like the most if you're interested in actually owning a copy of the book. The book has one of my least favorite fantasy tropes, and yet I love the story anyway. Because it was written in the 1950s and expanded in the 1960s, that means that this trope was not overused at the time that it originally appeared. However, today I feel like the trope is overdone. And that is an idea from Mark Twain's story, The Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, where a person from the modern time, from the writer's point of view, ends up back in the past in a fantasy or medieval kind of setting, the fish out of water situation that is created from that. I'm not a big fan of it in general because I don't think it's that interesting to have people from our time end up in that setting and end up confused and having to figure it out. But back, like I was saying, back in the 1950s and 60s, this was not overdone yet. You had Mark Twain, you have this story, I guess you did have C.S. Lewis and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which also has lion in the title, now that I think about it. But that was kind of different because it was portal magic instead of a time travel-y kind of thing. But either way, as long as you're fine with that trope or an understanding that that type of story was not overdone back then I think that you'll be fine with this book. But that is the core concept. We've got a soldier from World War II, Holger. He is actually a trained engineer, like a mechanical engineer or something based on the note at the beginning of the book. He's a resistance fighter, a Danish resistance fighter. He's fighting the Nazis. Something happens and he wakes up in an alternate version or in the past of our Earth. And it's funny because Tolkien has Middle Earth. This is called the Middle World. So it's the same sort of concept. And there are creatures like you would find in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings in this story. It's a lot of fun. It's an adventure story. He is essentially a brave knight, a brave soldier. He has to befriend allies who will help him along the way. He has to go on a quest to get a magnificent sword that is needed, and his arch enemy ends up being none other than Morgan Le Fay. A lot of exciting fantasy stuff in here, though you can see it's borrowed from multiple places. The reason that this story was such a huge inspiration to Gary Gygax for forming Dungeons and Dragons, the base of role-playing systems and thus much of video games and all of that, is because this story very much talks about law versus chaos. And that ended up being used as an alignment system in role-playing. That you have a character who is lawful or chaotic. Put on, a line or a graph system of lawful versus chaotic. In this story, the fairy creatures who serve either Alfric, the king of them, who's like Oberon, or Morgan Le Fay, those fairy creatures are viewed as chaotic, and thus they're evil, bad, they're antagonists. And the main character, he is a good soldier, he follows the laws and the rules, he is lawful, and got that basic concept going. I know it sounds a lot like good versus evil, but lawful versus chaotic is technically different from good versus evil, and thus I think that's one of the reasons that it worked for role-playing games over the years. His companions along the way include a beautiful woman who has the ability to turn into a swan. And that may not seem like that great of a superpower or magical ability, but it's really interesting when you think about it, because she can just seem to be an ordinary animal in the background. She also can fly when she is a swan, so that's pretty cool. And he tries so hard, of course, not to fall in love with her, because he's planning to leave and go back home to his proper timeline fighting the Nazis. He's also got a dwarf who he befriends. They get to fight creatures that are very much the kind of creatures that you would see in a Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, or D&D kind of setting. But this is actually the origin of the troll as its powers are in D&D, which is different from the Tolkien trolls. And that's where the trolls get their regenerative abilities and all of that. So it's fascinating to think about how an author can publish a book and it inspires someone who creates something else with it, which clearly you're seeing through this whole process. There's also a fun creature in it called a nixie, and nixies are water pixies, water fae creatures. You may be familiar with them from mythology or literature. I highly recommend the book if you like fantasy, if you're interested in classic fantasy, especially if you're doing an Appendix N challenge. This is a great one to read to fulfill your Poul Anderson requirement. Alright, that's it for today. Every day is a good day for a book talk. Peace.